Hi, I'm Konrad Marshall, and from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, welcome to Good Weekend Talks, a magazine for your ears featuring in-depth conversations with fascinating people from sport and politics, science and culture, business and beyond. Every week you can download new episodes in which top journalists from across our newsrooms talk to compelling people about the definitive stories of the day. In this episode, we speak to Jon Ronson. The Welsh journalist, podcaster and author is probably best known for his 2011 book, The Psychopath Test. And he's with us today in the approach to the US presidential elections to talk about the many psychos among us and how they seem to rule the world. He also brings the full weight of his expertise to a simple question. Is Donald Trump a psychopath, a sociopath, or a narcissist? Ronson has lived in the US for a number of years, so he joins me remotely from the east coast of America to chat about everything from escaping echo chambers to exercising while reading and the challenge of writing funny prose. Welcome, Jon.
Hi, nice to see you.
You too. So it's Thursday morning here in Melbourne, which I'm guessing means it's like Saturday evening 2 weeks ago or something like that in New York. No, I know that it's Wednesday night.
It's the before times here in New York. It's 6 p.m. There's a lovely sunset. I just moved to a former alpaca farm in upstate New York. There's still like straw in the alpaca birthing shed. So that's kind of exciting. It makes me feel like a real man.
Fantastic. I actually lived in upstate New York for about 5 years, but I think a bit further north than you. I was in a little town called Glens Falls in the Adirondack Mountains, kind of north of Albany, up near Lake George. Yeah. You're more proximate to Manhattan, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm 2 hours. I'm like probably an hour south of where you were. I'm 2 hours north of Manhattan.
Gorgeous country.
We live in the same village as Daniel Day-Lewis, and I once saw him cycle past my house in Lycra. I'm pretty sure it was him.
So that's like only in New York, but only in upstate New York.
Yeah, exactly. There's been a big exodus, a very big exodus since the pandemic.
I can imagine. So look, the first time I encountered your work wasn't actually on the page. It was on This American Life, where your stories have been kind of featured quite often. And it was you reading an excerpt of your book, The Psychopath Test. And it was this very cool scene visiting the Florida home of this notorious formerly CEO of Sunbeam. And you were there to ask him about his potential psychopathy. And it was hilarious. But at the time, and even now, re-listening to it yesterday, I almost felt like part of the success in you teasing him out was your voice, that kind of lilting Welsh accent, this sort of disarming, innocent, almost naive way of approaching him. Reminded me a little bit of Louis Theroux. Do you put any stock in the kind of the power of your particular accent and voice?
Yeah, I think I'm luckily non-threatening. I come over as non-threatening. I remember the very first thing I ever made was this documentary called Tottenham Ayatollah, which was a year in the life of a militant Islamist called Omar Bakri, who said he wouldn't rest until he saw the flag of Islam flying over Downing Street. And so I followed him around for a year. At one point he said to me, I've let you into my life. I've given you much. I would like something in return. And I said, what? And he said, will you drive me to Office World? Because that's where he gets his pamphlets, his crushed Great Britain pamphlets photocopied because of their special price pamphlets. Anyway, the reason why I say all of this is because I always remember at one point he turned to me and Saul Dibb, who I was making the documentary with, and he said, you're not journalists, you're students. And I realised the power of and we didn't lie. We said, no, we really are proper journalists. But because we're so shambolic and we're not ideological, we're not going in to ambush people, we're going in with genuine curiosity. So a mixture of my sort of soft-spokenness and my genuine curiosity and my lack of an agenda, I think does mean that people feel more confident to go places that they wouldn't normally go to.
Yeah. I vividly remember something similar just from my own experience in upstate New York when I kind of landed there. I could go out to interviews with very American people in really rural areas and, I don't know, be a little bit bumbling, a little bit self-deprecating, and they would sort of invite the oblivious foreigner in, maybe more than they would, the agenda journalist.
I think so. Although I would say I think that's slightly changed. I was at a party the other day. There were some people there from the Washington Post and some other, big legacy media places. And we had a bit of a conversation and we all agreed that the legacy media, because the legacy media has taken such a battering, partly, its own fault, these last few years, there isn't quite the obligation for people to talk to us that there used to be. So it's harder to get access to people now. When I was starting out, even if I was working for the BBC's competitor, Channel 4, they still kind of saw it as the BBC. And people just felt obliged to talk to me. And I think now that the old institutions are crumbling and we're all living in a kind of post-institution world, I actually think it's going to be harder for people like us to get access to people. And I've already started that beginning to change. Yeah,
I think we sense that in all fields. Your work also reminds me a little bit, and again, it's part of that whole vibe of the way you approach things, of David Sedaris. You both sort of straddle this kind of line between journalism and storytelling. But I was wondering, would you ever embroider your tales in the way that Sedaris is said to do, or do you draw a pretty hard line about the truth you're telling?
Yeah, the latter. I love David Sedaris, but when I heard him give an interview and somebody said, "Oh, your story's true," and he said they're true enough, I didn't like that answer. I think nonfiction people should take any of the techniques that novelists have to keep you reading, cliffhangers and leaving things unsaid and experimenting with structure and all of those things. But I do think people need to know that they're reading that it's the truth.
Yeah.
So I do take more of a hard line about that than David Sedaris does, I'd say.
I think I knew that was your answer. In fact, I've heard you say before, what was it? Be a twig in the tidal wave of the story. Just let it go and accept the contradictions or ambiguities.
Totally. I'm inspired by I'm inspired by fiction writers. I was inspired by Raymond Carver and Kurt Vonnegut and George Saunders. So I definitely adhere to that whole Tom Wolfe principle from the late 60s of narrative nonfiction, experimental narrative nonfiction. And I really admired all of those people, George Plimpton and Joe Esterhaus and Joan Didion and that whole crowd. But they all also would tell the truth. There was never any... that amazing Gay Talese essay, I just reread it the other day, Frank Sinatra Has a Cold.
Oh, yeah.
It was, I think the very first example of somebody writing a story about how they couldn't get an interview with someone. And so he kind of invented a whole genre there. And but yeah, you love the fictional techniques, but I think you'd be pretty horrified if you found out some of it was fiction.
Totally. So that's a good segue, actually, from a question I had about your oral voice into your written voice. You're a very, very funny writer when you want to be. And I don't just say that to compliment you, because I want to sort of ask what that takes, because I think anyone and everyone who's written for a living would say it's actually much harder to make someone laugh than it is to make them cry. Like, pathos is kind of easy. Hilarity's the hard part. Does that just come naturally to you, or do you kind of, I don't know, look at other writers and pick up their devices and sort of mimic their tricks, or have you always been kind of funny on the page?
I think I always try and be funny. I always try and look for the joke, especially if it's a really dark, upsetting story. Mentioning Kurt Vonnegut earlier, what I really learned from him when I was a teenager was if comedy, if humour and horror smash up against each other, it can make the humour funnier and the horror more horrific. And I think a lot of people shy away from those tonal shifts these days, but I say, go for it. But yeah, I'm always hoping to find the joke. Like if I write something that's funny, then I feel like it's been a good day's work. I'm writing a book. I'm writing a book at the moment, and I think it's really funny. I think there's lots of good one-liners in there that'll make people laugh, and I think, I think if I could end the day thinking that thing I just wrote, in a year's time, people will laugh out loud. That really feels like a day of achievement.
Do you road test the material on any particular kind of trusted ear, like a partner or a long-time editor? Like, is this funny or am I missing the mark?
I'd test it out with my wife, but then again, she knows what a nightmare I'd be if she expressed anything other than like total praise. So I'm not sure that I can trust her. I'm not sure I can trust her feedback.
Let's talk a little bit about psychopathy, because that's what brings you to Australia next month. You're headed here for a series of events called Psychopath Night, starting on Wednesday, November 20 at Hamer Hall down here in Melbourne. Just for readers who aren't familiar, can you tell us what led you to investigate the psychos among us, which was, like 20 years ago or so that you would have started?
I started 15 years ago, so and then the book came out like maybe 13 years ago. So this is the 15th anniversary of the beginning of the journey. I think there was a few starting points, but one of the major starting points was this Harvard psychologist telling me that you were 4 times more likely to have a psychopath at the top of the tree than at the bottom. And which when I remember saying that to a few friends, I said, you wouldn't believe what someone just told me. And they were like, yeah, we know that. And I'm like, no, this is actually a huge thought. Like what she is saying, that there's this particular mental disorder, and it's the worst of all the mental disorders. None other come close. And that's the one that we as a society have decided to reward. So I had a brainwave. I had a kind of eureka moment when I thought, well, how can I tell this story? And I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll go on a course and I'll learn how to spot psychopaths. And then I'll journey into the corridors of power, seeing if I could spot any psychopaths. And I thought, well, I don't know what's going to happen, but whatever it is going to be good. So that gave me that idea was basically what led to the book, to the psychopath test.
And you learned how to administer, like to formally administer that test, right?
Yeah, from the man himself, from Robert Hare, who created the checklist. He's basically the father of. When you think of definitions of psychopathy since the 1970s, I'd say you're thinking of Robert Hare's work. So I learned from the man himself. I went on a course, and it was extraordinary. I was an extraordinary, because the course is like it's this weird mix of like almost like amateur sleuth, because the thing about psychopathy is that it's buried beneath the surface. It's hard to discern. So you have to like root them out in sort of subtle ways. It's all about linguistics. It's all about reading between the lines of a person's turn of phrase and so on. Now, that makes it sound like I don't think it's real, that I think it's like a pseudoscience. But that's not true. I do actually think it's real. I think there really are psychopaths out there. And I think Robert Hare's checklist is a really good way of rooting them out. But I think there's a massive downside to it too, which is if it's misused, it could, you can get drunk with your psychopath spotting powers, and there's and also psychopaths aren't, unlike most other mental disorders or mental illnesses, psychopaths aren't invited to take part in their diagnoses because they're untrustworthy. So you can see that there's a huge potential for miscarriage of justice there as well. So that's something I really love about the story, is that it's both a really interesting look into the nuances of this very real mental disorder, but it's also at the same time a kind of critique of people getting too drunk with their psychopath spotting powers, and maybe there's a kind of tyranny to diagnosing people with different disorders. So it's just a lovely, complicated story to dive into.
Well, let's simplify it a little bit. What, in simplest terms, is a psychopath, if you boil down that checklist by Hare?
Well, I guess the main item, it's a 20-point checklist, and if you can score 0, 1 or 2 on each of them, and so obviously the top score is 40. If you score, it differs slightly in different countries. I'm not sure what it is in Australia. I think in Britain it's 26, and in America it's 27, and that's like the cutoff that you're the psychopath if you score that number on the checklist. And so the items on the checklist are, I mean, the big one is lack of empathy, callous lack of empathy. That's the one from which all the others stem, I think. So it's glib, superficial charm, shallow affect. There's real good, and those two are both saying the same thing, which is that there's not many emotions. The emotions are skin deep.
Yep.
And there's not much going on under the surface. Then there's things like cunning, manipulative, pathological lying, lack of realistic long-term goals, impulsivity, promiscuous sexual behaviour, many short-term marital relationships. So it kind of runs, it sort of runs a range of different, lifestyle choices.
Okay. So the promo for your upcoming shows, they pose a few questions, and I apologise if these aren't your questions, if they're just the marketing machine, but they're like, are you friends with a psychopath? And are you worried that you might be one? But there's another question in there that I just wanted to focus on or ask you, given that we're 1 month away from the US presidential election, and that's namely, do psychopaths rule the world? Well, do they? What's the answer?
I think yes. I think when I wrote and published the book, I was more hedgy because I could see how becoming a psychopath hunter could turn you a little bit psychopathic, and your desire to reduce people to items on a checklist. There's obviously something tyrannical about that. But honestly, we're living in a society that rewards so many of the items on the psychopath checklist. Capitalism rewards most of the items on the checklist. Lack of remorse. So one of the people I meet in my book is Al Dunlap, the CEO of Sunbeam, and clearly displayed many psychopathic traits. And when he got the job as CEO,
his property there with the statues of panthers and eagles, just predators all throughout the grounds, paintings of them throughout the house. It was, quite the picture. You would have been able to diagnose based on that alone.
Totally. It's like the Queen of Narnia turned up and with a massive zoo of ferocious animals and turned them all to stone and stuck them on his garden. He was the Fast Company magazine, when I was researching the book, did a sort of who were the 50 worst psychopaths in corporate leadership. And Al Dunlap was the only one they named who was still alive. So that was another reason why I contacted him. All the others were, JP Morgan and people. And so I realised writing the book that you have to be careful about these skills, because you can misdiagnose. As psychopathic as Al Dunlap was, lots of things about him weren't psychopathic. When I said to him, do you have, what about juvenile delinquency? He said he got accepted into West Point, and they didn't let, tearaways into West Point. So, even someone like Al Dunlap was complicated. However, it's like 15 years later now, and we're living in a society that doesn't only, capitalism clearly rewards psychopathic behaviour, but social media more and more rewards, if not lack of empathy, then highly selective empathy for your own tribe, and a total lack of empathy for everybody else. Pathological lying. You just go on X today, and it's all pathological lying. And not just pathological lying, but in the checklist, they say, underneath pathological lying, it says something like, doesn't feel embarrassed if they're caught lying. And and who does that remind you of? Practically everyone these days pathologically lies and aren't embarrassed when they're caught lying. So I really do think it's not glib, which is another item on the checklist, to say that we're living in a society that rewards psychopathic values in many different ways.
You must have been asked then, Donald Trump, psychopath, sociopath, narcissist, where do you, if you're putting your amateur diagnosing hat on, what do you think?
Well, okay, so let me answer that question with a question of my own. When you think of Donald Trump, when you think of what's going on under the surface, Do you think that Donald Trump is like this, chasm where there's no emotions under the surface? Or do you think what's going on under the surface are a tremendous amount of emotions that he can't handle and he's suppressing? Right. And I kind of veer to the latter, right?
Absolutely.
He's not a controlled person like psychopaths are. So as a total armchair diagnosis here, but he's been in our lives for a long time now. So I think, you can feel a little bit freer to talk about Trump because there's so much material out there. I think he's a narcissist.
You're a naturalised American, so am I. I remember taking the oath of allegiance and crossing my fingers behind my back, only because they asked me to renounce my allegiance to Australia. But I moved home.
They didn't ask me to do that, I don't think. I got my oath of allegiance on March the 13th, 2020, which was the day of lockdown. It was the last naturalisation ceremony for years. So it was all weird. Yeah, everybody was like nervous. There was like 200 people in the room and nobody wanted to be there because, it was the day of lockdown. And yeah, they got us in and out in about 15 minutes. So maybe they forgot to tell me to renounce Great Britain.
Oh, man, no, I remember the hand was up and it was like, I hereby renounce all allegiance to foreign nation states and potentates.
Right. Maybe I did do that. I don't remember.
But look, I moved home 15 years ago. So I haven't sort of seen what's gone on in America up close the way that you have. How do you just feel generally about the country and where it sits now? Are you as troubled as some people seem to be about it sitting on a precipice, or are you kind of less overwhelmed? And I don't know, do you feel like the fear right now is a bit hysterical or well-placed?
Yeah, no, I think I'm actually kind of a good person to answer this question for a couple of reasons. First, I live in a village in upstate New York, which is really split, like 50-50. And also, about a year ago, I made a documentary for Audible called The Debutante, which looked at, and actually some of my BBC show, Things Fell Apart, also look at the same thing, which is this idea that civil war is imminent in America. Is that real or is it overblown? And I came, for both reasons, I've got to say, I've come to the conclusion that I think these anxieties are overblown. There's a really interesting thing about these academics who are pushing the narrative that civil war is imminent in America. Let me try this out. I hope it's not going to be too in the weeds. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, a lot of this comes from a bunch of academics and historians, and their agenda is to show that the far right in America, the militias and the white supremacist groups and so on, they're not a bunch of disparate, groups they're actually a coordinated conspiracy who are intent on kickstarting ethnic-based civil war.
Yep.
Now, but the reason why they believe that, by and large, actually isn't because they've studied America. A lot of these people. So, for instance, there's this Dr. Barbara Walter. She was part of a CIA task force, and so she would study how civil wars started in Rwanda and in Bosnia and so on. And what she found was that civil wars always start on ethnic grounds, when one ethnic group is feeling disenfranchised and they lash out against another ethnic group. And so if civil war is imminent in America, it must be ethnic-based. It must be white supremacists. And I think she's presumably absolutely right about other countries. But I just don't think that's true about America. I think that there obviously are white supremacist groups, but, a lot of but actually what's much more prevalent in America among those groups is an anti-government idea. It's a sort of libertarianism. And there isn't racism. Even these people who were arrested and some of them jailed for plotting to kidnap the governor of Michigan, they were secretly recorded for hundreds of hours And they said the most terrible things. We're going to, behead this vaccine doctor. We're going to do this. We're going to murder cops. We're going to, they said the most outrageous stuff. And there was no racism. Like there was, or if there was any racism, it was very fleeting and no worse than you'd hear of, Zionists are running everything. I mean, Jesus, you hear that like everywhere.
Yeah.
So I think that's another reason why. I think, and also, I think most kids in a gun club in Michigan are just kids in a gun club in Michigan. I don't think they're part of a coordinated conspiracy. So, but also just being in my neighborhood, the only tension I've noticed being here for 6 or 7 years is, when richer people move in, they do it, their houses, property prices go up, and that can then push people who've been, so there's some tension around that. And frankly, I could totally see why there's tension around that.
Yeah.
But that's as far as it goes, I think. So I don't feel anywhere near as paranoid as I think a lot of people do about division in America.
That's good. I'll try to walk away and feel the same.
Yeah, which isn't to say, by the way, there's some people who believe everything that I just said who would go further and say January the 6th was no big deal. I don't think that. I think January the 6th was a very big deal, a truly shocking and horrifying thing. So I'm not, I'm not entirely black and white about this, as some people are. January the 6th was terrible and terrifying. And if Trump gets in and he acts in that way again with nothing to lose, then I would quite possibly revise everything that I just said. But in general, I would say that sort of progressive idea that the right in America are these terrifying white supremacists, I don't buy.
Yeah. Look, and those ideas do seem to come a lot from the echo chambers that we exist in, both on the right and the left, the kind of silos we create. I'm just curious, how do you personally avoid bouncing around inside one of those echo chambers of your own making? Like, it's very hard to dodge all the algorithms that kind of govern our lives. Are there any sort of conscious, tangible steps that you take that, I don't know, that others can take? Got any advice for us there?
Yeah. Oh, in fact, just today, actually, I can't even, God, it was this morning, I was going down some rabbit hole and I listened to a left-wing. Oh, it was about the causes of the riots in Britain. There was a terrible murder of 3 children in Liverpool, Southport, which is near Liverpool, and a bunch of riots broke out, partly due to misinformation. So I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole about that. The murderer was a second-generation immigrant. Apparently from a Christian Rwandan family, so it was nothing to do with Islam, which is what the right wingers were saying, and the reason then mosques were set on fire and so on. Yeah. So I went down a whole rabbit hole about that, and I did make the conscious decision, like I want to know what the right, like I want to watch some right wing YouTube shows about this. So I consciously today challenged my own preconceptions by seeing what the right wingers were saying about it and what they were angry about. And so it's just stuff like that. Just don't, be aware of how pernicious an echo chamber can be in every way. We in terms of, demonizing our enemies, and we become way more warlike when we're in an echo chamber. We're just being, egged on by each other. So, yeah, I was glad I made that conscious decision today, and I would certainly encourage people to do that kind of thing.
Well, I was totally expecting you to say that your solution would be to sort of step away from those fields, get off Twitter or do something like that. I didn't know that going further in but wider afield would be the answer. And then I think I actually do sort of, like I stay Facebook friends with some crazy right-wing people that I knew from that former life over in America, people that I didn't realize at the time, colleagues that were really evangelical Christians and espouse sort of pretty nutty views on their feeds. But I don't know, I feel more well-rounded for knowing what it is that they think, rather than just going, I'm gonna block them, I'm gonna cut them out.
Yeah, I really agree. And the reason why I went further down was because, I make documentaries about the culture wars. So I'm going to, so I kind of need to be scrabbling around, in the mud down there as part of my research. But certainly if I'm hanging out with people, my son, he's left wing, but, he brings up friends of all sorts, to stay. And, some of them are conservative, some of them are extremely progressive. And, so, that's healthy too, I'd say.
Yeah. Look, the culture wars does feel like something you've explored for a long time. You wrote another book, of course, called So You've Been Publicly Shamed. Cancel culture's only kind of grown in the decade or so since you wrote that book. I'm just wondering if your thinking on it has changed at all in that time, if you've seen anything kind of new, positive or negative in that space.
Well, I think it's moved from the left to the right. And what hypocrites the right were going on all of these years about, the left-wing echo chamber. You step out of line and then they'll come for you, blah, blah, blah. The second Elon Musk takes over Twitter, the left all, flee and lose their power on places like Blue Sky. No one's going to be destroyed because of the tweet storm about Blue Sky.
Yeah.
The right wing just immediately take up all of the power that they were attacking the left for and gleefully going for people in exactly the same way. So that's been the big shift, I'd say, is a shift. Now, and I get into trouble. Sometimes I attack, I don't really attack anyone, but sometimes I'm like critical of centrists or people, and they're always like, they say, oh, we're so disappointed in you, so you've been publicly shamed. You looked at, how terrible the mob is and that kind of crowd theory. And I'm thinking, yeah, but you're the ones who are doing it now. So I'm going to be, so actually I'm being consistent here. Like, I'm against this technique that now you are doing.
I just wanted to finish off. It looks beautiful where you are there, and I heard you speaking recently about exercise. You hike or run or walk every day, and you often listen to books on tape as you do so. And I think you said you'll happily listen to a book over the course of like 15 hours while wandering through the world instead of sitting on the couch and cracking the spine of it. Why is that your method of consumption?
I think I definitely concentrate better when I'm listening more than reading. There's always the danger that, you're walking through the woods listening to an audiobook for work and you see a squirrel and then you miss a paragraph. So if you've got a slightly flighty mind like I do, there is that danger. But it's just more healthy. I think, it's hard enough. That part of the process when you're just listening to an audiobook, hoping to find a story, is pretty bleak. It's like pretty bleak because, if you're sitting on a bench listening to an audiobook, you might suddenly think with horror, I'm just a man sitting on a bench. So at least if you're hiking or at least if you're having if it's not working out, if you're going down a rabbit hole and you're getting nothing, at least you had a nice hike too. So I think that's a lot to do with it. I think also you'd put on weight. I don't want to gain weight, so I want to stay healthy for that reason. But sometimes I do think, I've just listened to a 10-hour audiobook. Was I doing that for the walk? Like, was I actually thinking I was being productive, but actually I was being unproductive? So I think you need to watch out for that. You need to know when a line of inquiry isn't working and you should just give it up, not just keep walking because you're enjoying the walk.
Absolutely. Or you could listen to bite-sized 30-minute episodes of Good Weekend Talks once a week.
Yeah, absolutely. I would absolutely recommend that.
Well, look, thank you so much for joining us, Jon. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you on stage at Hamer Hall next month.
Yeah, it'd be really nice. It'll be my first time in Melbourne since 2015, 2016, and I can't wait. I always have a wonderful time in Melbourne.
Good Weekend Talks is brought to you by the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Subscriptions power our newsrooms. To support independent journalism, search Subscribe Sydney Morning Herald or The Age. And if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe, rate and comment wherever you get your podcasts. This episode of Good Weekend Talks is produced by Chi Wong. Technical assistance from Julia Carcatzel. Editing from Konrad Marshall. Tom McKendrick is head of audio. And Katrina Strickland is the editor of Good Weekend.